The champagne bubbles caught the light from the boardroom's crystal chandelier as Marcus Sullivan raised his glass, savoring what he believed was his moment of ultimate triumph. Around him, his hand-picked team of executives mirrored his gesture, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a successful corporate coup. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, gentlemen, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated through 15 years of strategic acquisitions and hostile takeovers. To the new era of Skyward Airlines, may we finally bring proper leadership to this wayward company. The crystal clinked together as they toasted, and Marcus allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. After months of careful maneuvering, strategic stock purchases, and backroom negotiations with key shareholders, he had finally achieved what many thought impossible: the removal of Skyward Airlines CEO, Dr. Amara Washington. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom, Marcus could see the sprawling tarmac of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Skyward's distinctive silver and blue aircraft dotted the landscape like pieces on a chessboard, a game he had just decisively won. The Washington era is officially over, declared Richard Pembroke, his newly appointed VP of Operations, adjusting his Hermes tie with the satisfaction of a man who had just been promoted 3 levels above his previous position. No more of her touchy-feely diversity initiatives or her obsession with employee satisfaction surveys. Marcus nodded approvingly. Dr. Washington's leadership style had been everything he despised in modern corporate culture: too soft, too focused on employee welfare, too concerned with what she called sustainable growth rather than maximum profit extraction. Under his leadership, Skyward would return to the aggressive, results-driven approach that had made American aviation great. The board meeting tomorrow will be a formality, added Jonathan Blake, the new CFO, whose previous experience consisted mainly of cost-cutting measures that had earned him the nickname Slash and Burn Blake at his former company. With our controlling interests secured through the Meridian Holdings acquisition, we have the votes to formalize the leadership change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus walked to the window, his reflection overlapping with the view of the aircraft below. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His company, Sullivan Strategic Holdings, had built its reputation on identifying undervalued companies with weak leadership and transforming them into profit machines. Skyward Airlines, with its focus on employee benefits and customer service over pure profitability, had been an obvious target. "What's the status on the Washington transition?" he asked, not turning from the window. "Security escorted her out this morning," reported David Chen, his new VP of Strategic Planning. "She seemed surprisingly calm, actually. Almost like she expected it." Marcus frowned slightly. He had anticipated more resistance from Dr. Washington: protests, legal challenges, public statements to the media. Her quiet acceptance of defeat struck him as uncharacteristically passive for someone who had fought so hard for her vision of the company. "Probably shock," Richard suggested, loosening his tie as he settled into one of the leather chairs around the conference table. "These diversity hires never expect their luck to run out eventually." The casual racism in Richard's comment would have prompted a sharp rebuke from Dr. Washington, but Marcus merely shrugged. Richard's attitude was crude but not entirely inaccurate. Washington had been promoted to CEO at an unusually young age for the airline industry, and her Harvard MBA and doctorate in organizational psychology had always struck Marcus as more academic theory than practical business experience. "Speaking of transitions," Jonathan said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through financial projections, "I've identified immediate cost savings we can implement. The employee wellness programs she championed are burning through nearly 40 million annually. The diversity training initiatives, another 15 million. And don't get me started on the employee profit-sharing program. Marcus's eyes lit up. Employee profit-sharing had been one of Dr. Washington's signature policies, distributing a percentage of quarterly profits directly to all employees based on their tenure and performance ratings. It was exactly the kind of bleeding-heart initiative that reduced shareholder value in favor of feel-good gestures. "Eliminate them all," he ordered. "Draft the memos tonight. I want the changes implemented by Friday." "What about potential pushback from the workforce?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was merely going through the motions of due diligence rather than expressing genuine concern. Marcus turned from the window, his expression hardening. "Let me be clear about something, gentlemen. This company has been run like a social experiment for too long. We're in the business of moving people from point A to point B efficiently and profitably, not running a charity. The employees will adapt or find employment elsewhere." A soft knock interrupted the meeting. Marcus's assistant, Patricia, entered. With the cautious demeanor of someone who had learned to read her boss's moods carefully. "Mr. Sullivan, I apologize for the interruption, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent and concerns the transition of leadership." Marcus frowned. "Did she give a name?" Patricia hesitated. "She said her name was Alexandria Carter, and she represents the primary stakeholder in Skyward Airlines." The men exchanged glances. Through their extensive research into Skyward's ownership structure, they had identified all major shareholders. The name Alexandria Carter wasn't familiar, but in the complex world of corporate ownership, shell companies and holding entities often obscured the true identity of major investors. "Send her in," Marcus decided. If this Alexandria Carter represented a significant stakeholder, it would be wise to understand her position on the leadership change. Building relationships with major investors was crucial to maintaining control. Patricia nodded and withdrew. Moments later, she returned, followed by a woman who immediately commanded attention despite her understated appearance. Alexandria Carter was tall and elegant, probably in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional chignon. Her navy blue suit was expertly tailored but not ostentatious, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a subtle Southern accent that spoke of old money and established influence. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Marcus stood, extending his hand with his most practiced executive smile. "Not at all, Ms. Carter. I'm Marcus Sullivan, the new CEO of Skyward Airlines. These are my senior executives. Please, have a seat." Alexandria shook his hand with a firm grip, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that was slightly unsettling. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I'm here because I wanted to meet the man who believes he's taken control of my company." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's smile faltered slightly as he processed her words. "I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand. According to our research, Meridian Holdings provided us with the controlling interest necessary to effect the leadership change. Are you suggesting there's some irregularity in the ownership structure?" Alexandria took the offered chair, crossing her legs and regarding each man in turn with the analytical gaze of a predator assessing her prey. "Oh, there's no irregularity, Mr. Sullivan. Meridian Holdings did indeed facilitate your acquisition of what you believe to be a controlling interest in Skyward Airlines." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it on the conference table with deliberate precision. "However, I think you may have misunderstood the nature of your acquisition." Jonathan leaned forward, his financial instincts triggered. "Ms. Carter, if you're suggesting that our legal team missed something in the due diligence process, I assure you that Sullivan Strategic Holdings employs the most thorough—" "I'm sure you do," Alexandria interrupted smoothly. But sometimes the most thorough research can miss the forest for the trees." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a document, sliding it across the polished table toward Marcus. This is the original charter for Skyward Airlines, filed with the Georgia Secretary of State in 1987. You'll note the name of the founding owner. Marcus picked up the document, his eyes scanning the legal text until they reached the signature line. His face went pale as he read the name. A.C. Washington, Principal. Owner and founder, I don't understand, he said slowly. The records show that Skyward went public in 1992. The ownership was distributed among thousands of shareholders. Alexandria's smile was patient, like a teacher explaining a complex concept to a particularly slow student. Indeed it did. 49% of the company went public. The remaining 51% has remained in family hands through a complex series of trusts and holding companies. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Family hands? Dr. Amara Washington, Alexandria said, her voice taking on a slight edge of pride, is my daughter. And while you gentlemen were congratulating yourselves on acquiring a controlling interest in Skyward Airlines, you actually purchased less than 30% of the available shares. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at the document in his hands, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications. Everything they had planned, all their strategic maneuvering, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the company's ownership structure. That's impossible, David said, his voice cracking slightly. Our research team spent months analyzing the shareholder records, every SEC filing, every quarterly report, every public document, Alexandria confirmed, which, by definition, only reflects the publicly traded shares. The private holdings have been carefully maintained through a network of family trusts, none of which are required to file public disclosure statements. She stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt as she prepared to deliver what Marcus was beginning to realize would be a devastating blow. Gentlemen, you have successfully acquired a minority stake in my family's airline. Dr. Amara Washington was never removed as CEO because she was never in danger of being removed. The board meeting you mentioned for tomorrow? My daughter will be presiding over it, as she has every right to do as the majority owner. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. Everything he had built his reputation on, his ability to identify vulnerable companies, his skill at hostile takeovers, his talent for recognizing weak leadership, had led him into what was beginning to look like an elaborate trap. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why allow us to go through with the acquisition if you knew we couldn't actually take control? Alexandria's smile was no longer patient. It had transformed into something sharp and predatory, revealing the steel beneath her polished exterior. Because, Mr. Sullivan, sometimes the best way to deal with a persistent problem is to let it solve itself. She gathered her materials, her movements deliberate and unhurried. My daughter has been dealing with your acquisition attempts for 2 years. Your company has a particular reputation in the industry. You identify successful businesses led by women or minorities, launch hostile takeover attempts, and then gut them for parts while claiming to improve efficiency. The truth of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. It was exactly what Sullivan's strategic holdings did, and it had made him extraordinarily wealthy. But hearing it described so clinically, so accurately, made it sound less like business, strategy, and more like systematic predation. Skyward Airlines has been our family's business for over 3 decades, Alexandria continued. We've built it into one of the most respected carriers in the industry through a commitment to our employees, our customers, and sustainable growth. Did you really think we would allow someone like you to destroy that legacy? She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to address the stunned men one final time. Oh, and Mr. Sullivan? Your new offices? They're lovely. We had them designed specifically for this meeting. I hope you enjoyed the champagne. It's a 1996 Dom Perignon from my personal collection. Consider it a welcome gift. As the door closed, behind her, Marcus sank into his chair, the reality of his situation finally beginning to crystallize. They had not executed a hostile takeover. They had walked directly into an ambush. And the woman who had just calmly dismantled their entire plan was not just a concerned stakeholder. She was the power behind the throne they thought they had captured. Richard was the first to break the stunned silence. This has to be some kind of bluff. The SEC filings show exactly what they were legally required to show, Jonathan interrupted, his financial acumen finally catching up to the situation. Private family trusts, holding companies registered. In different states, offshore entities. There are dozens of ways to maintain control while keeping the ownership structure opaque. Marcus stared out the window at the Skyward aircraft, realizing with growing horror that none of it belonged to him. Worse, his company had just spent nearly $2 billion to acquire what amounted to a minority stake in a company whose true owners had been watching their every move. "Sir," David said hesitantly, "what do we do now?" Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his reputation, his company's future, and his own massive miscalculation pressing down on him. When he opened them again, his reflection in the window looked older, more uncertain than it had just minutes before. "Now," he said quietly, "we find out exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes." As the sun began to set over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the boardroom where Marcus had celebrated his victory just hours earlier, the true game was only beginning. Somewhere in the building, Dr. Amara Washington was preparing for a board meeting where she would reveal just how thoroughly she and her family had outmaneuvered one of the corporate world's most feared acquisition specialists. The hostile takeover had failed before it even began. But the real question was whether Marcus Sullivan would understand the lesson being taught, or whether pride would drive him deeper into a battle he had already lost. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine not just the future of Skyward Airlines, but the fate of every person who had underestimated the Washington family's commitment to protecting what they had built. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dr. Amara Washington's corner office as she reviewed the surveillance footage from yesterday's boardroom meeting. Her fingers moved gracefully across the tablet screen, pausing the video at the exact moment Marcus Sullivan's face had drained of color upon reading her father's original charter document. 24 floors below, she could see Sullivan Strategic Holdings rental cars still parked in the executive lot. The men who had celebrated her supposed downfall were undoubtedly spending a sleepless night trying to understand how their meticulously planned hostile takeover had transformed into what was beginning to look like corporate suicide. "They arrived early," said Carmen Rodriguez, her chief operating officer and closest confidant, entering with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Security logged Marcus Sullivan at 5:47 a.m. His whole team followed within the next 30 minutes. Amara accepted the coffee, savoring its rich aroma as she contemplated the delicious irony. The men who had mocked her leadership style as too soft, too collaborative, were now scrambling to comprehend a strategy so sophisticated they hadn't even realized they were part of it. Mother's timing was perfect, she observed, switching to another camera angle that showed Sullivan pacing his temporary office like a caged animal. "Did you see his face when she mentioned the 1996 Dom Perignon? That was the year our IPO launched. Every detail was a message they were too arrogant to decode." Carmen settled into the leather chair across from Amara's desk, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal vindication. As a Latina who had worked her way up through the ranks despite facing her own share of discrimination, she had watched Sullivan Strategic Holdings' predatory tactics with particular disgust. "The beauty is that they actually helped us," Carmen said, pulling up financial projections on her own tablet. "Their acquisition attempt drove our stock price up 18% over the past 3 months. Our public shareholders made a fortune while Sullivan's group overpaid for shares that give them no real control." Amara smiled, remembering the countless late nights she and her team had spent orchestrating this elaborate trap. It had begun, too. Years ago, when Sullivan Strategic Holdings first appeared on their radar, circling Skyward Airlines like vultures sensing weakness. But what they had interpreted as vulnerability was actually preparation. The irony is exquisite, she mused, walking to the window that overlooked the same tarmac Marcus had admired yesterday. They spent months studying our public financial statements, analyzing our corporate structure, identifying what they saw as inefficiencies. But they never bothered to understand our actual business model. Through the glass, she could see the morning shift change in full swing. Skyward employees moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who took pride in their work, a workforce that Sullivan's cost-cutting measures would have decimated within months. Her phone buzzed with a "Aya." Text from her mother. Board meeting prep complete. Legal documentation verified. Showtime in 3 hours. Alexandria Carter had spent the night ensuring every aspect of their revelation would be legally bulletproof. The Washington family hadn't built their aviation empire by leaving things to chance, and today's board meeting would demonstrate the difference between inherited wealth and earned power. Status report on our actual shareholders? Amara asked, settling back into her chair. Carmen consulted her tablet. The pension investment fund confirmed their continued support this morning. The teachers' retirement system wants to increase their position. 3 sovereign wealth funds have expressed interest in long-term partnerships. Oh, and the employee stock ownership program voted unanimously to maintain current leadership. Each name on that list represented relationships built over years of consistent performance and ethical leadership. Unlike Sullivan's approach of acquiring control through aggressive buyouts, the Washington family had cultivated loyalty through results and respect. And Sullivan's financing? Leveraged to the limit, Carmen replied with barely concealed satisfaction. They used Skyward stock as collateral for additional loans to fund the acquisition. If our stock price drops significantly, their lenders can force immediate repayment. They're more vulnerable now than we've ever been. Amara processed this information, her strategic mind already calculating the implications. Sullivan Strategic Holdings hadn't just failed to acquire control of her company, they had put themselves at considerable financial risk in the process. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Michael Chen, entered with the respectful demeanor of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work environment. Dr. Washington, Marcus Sullivan is requesting an immediate meeting. He seems agitated. Through her window, Amara could see activity in the temporary offices Sullivan's team had established. Men in expensive suits huddled around conference tables, their body language radiating desperation and confusion. Schedule him for 15 minutes at 10 a.m., she decided. Conference room B, not my office. And Michael, make sure security has a clear view of the meeting. As Michael withdrew, Carmen leaned forward with curiosity. You're going to meet with him before the board presentation? I want to understand his next move, Amara explained. Men like Sullivan don't surrender easily. He'll either try negotiation, intimidation, or he'll attempt to find some legal loophole to challenge our ownership structure. She pulled up Sullivan's corporate profile on her computer, studying the man who had systematically targeted companies led by women and minorities. His track record was impressive from a purely financial perspective. 15 successful hostile takeovers in 8 years, each followed by aggressive restructuring that maximized short-term profits while decimating employee morale and long-term sustainability. He's built his entire reputation on identifying weak leadership, she observed. The cognitive dissonance of realizing he's been outmaneuvered by the people he assumed were incompetent must be causing considerable psychological stress. Carmen stood, gathering her materials for the morning staff meeting. Do you think he'll try to salvage something from this? Maybe negotiate for board representation or some kind of partnership? Amara considered the question, her fingers drumming against her desk as she analyzed Sullivan's probable response patterns. He's a predator, Carmen. Predators don't suddenly become partners when their hunt fails. He'll either cut his losses and retreat, or he'll escalate into something more dangerous. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of routine morning activities that felt anything but routine. Amara attended the daily operations briefing, where flight delays and passenger satisfaction metrics took on additional significance, knowing that Sullivan's team was undoubtedly analyzing every aspect of their performance for weaknesses. She reviewed quarterly earnings reports that showed consistent growth across all major performance indicators, a track record that made Sullivan's claims of poor leadership particularly absurd. She signed off on the employee wellness program expansion that Jonathan Blake had identified as wasteful spending, knowing that the investment in human capital was precisely what differentiated Skyward from its competitors. At 9:58 a.m., she walked into Conference Room B, choosing a seat that positioned her with her back to the windows and the morning sun at her advantage. Marcus Sullivan entered exactly on time, but the confident executive from yesterday had been replaced by someone whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the toll of a sleepless night. "Dr. Washington," he began, his voice carefully controlled but lacking its previous authority. "I believe we need to discuss the situation frankly." "Please, sit down, Mr. Sullivan," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I'm curious to hear your perspective on our situation." He settled into the chair, his movements precise but tense. "Your mother made some interesting claims yesterday. Claims that, if true, would invalidate months of due diligence performed by some of the most reputable financial analysts in the industry." Amara smiled, recognizing the opening gambit of someone hoping to find cracks in an opponent's position. "Those aren't claims, Mr. Sullivan. They're facts, verified by 3 independent auditing firms and registered with the appropriate regulatory agencies. But please, continue." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm proposing that we find a mutually beneficial resolution to this misunderstanding. Sullivan Strategic Holdings has significant resources and expertise that could benefit Skyward's growth trajectory. Perhaps we could discuss a strategic partnership rather than the adversarial relationship that seems to have developed." The offer was exactly what she had expected, an attempt to salvage something from his failed acquisition while positioning it as magnanimous cooperation. But the underlying arrogance was unchanged. He still believed his expertise was somehow necessary for her company's success. "That's an interesting proposal," she replied neutrally. "What specific expertise would Sullivan Strategic Holdings bring to Skyward Airlines?" Marcus leaned forward, his confidence returning as he moved into familiar territory. "Cost optimization, operational efficiency, strategic market positioning. My team has identified numerous areas where Skyward could improve profitability through focused restructuring." "You mean the employee wellness programs, diversity training initiatives, and profit-sharing arrangements that you discussed eliminating yesterday?" His face flushed slightly, realizing that their private conversations had somehow been monitored. "Those programs, while well-intentioned, represent inefficient capital allocation that reduces shareholder value." Amara stood, walking to the window where she could observe her employees preparing aircraft for the morning departure rush. "Mr. Sullivan, let me share something with you. Last quarter, Skyward Airlines achieved the highest customer satisfaction ratings in our industry segment. Our employee turnover rate is 60% below the industry average. Our operational efficiency exceeds our closest competitor by 12%. And our profit margins have grown consistently for 8 consecutive quarters." She turned back to face him, her voice taking on the edge of steel that her mother had displayed yesterday. "Every metric you would use to measure successful airline operations shows that Skyward is performing at the top of our industry. The programs you want to eliminate aren't inefficiencies. They're the foundation of our competitive advantage." Marcus's expression hardened as he realized his negotiating position was even weaker than he had assumed. "Dr. Washington, with respect, your academic background may not have prepared you for the realities of large-scale corporate management in a truly competitive environment." The condescension in his tone was so familiar, so predictable, that Amara almost laughed. It was the same attitude she had encountered throughout her career. the assumption that her Harvard MBA, her doctorate in organizational psychology, and her 15 years of aviation industry experience somehow counted for less than his pattern of acquiring and dismantling successful companies. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, returning to her seat with deliberate calm. "I've been CEO of Skyward Airlines for 7 years. In that time, we've expanded to 43 new destinations, increased our fleet by 30%, and grown our market share from 12 to 18%. We've done this while maintaining the highest safety ratings in the industry and achieving carbon neutrality 2 years ahead of our target." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "These are the performance metrics for every company Sullivan Strategic Holdings has acquired in the past decade. Without exception, long-term growth declined after your restructuring. Employee satisfaction plummeted. Customer retention dropped. 3 of your acquisitions are now facing bankruptcy." Marcus opened the folder, his face growing paler as he reviewed the carefully documented evidence of his company's track record. The numbers told a story he had never wanted to acknowledge, that his aggressive profit maximization strategies created short-term gains at the expense of sustainable business models. "Your expertise," Amara continued, "consists of identifying successful companies, extracting maximum value in the shortest possible time, and leaving behind hollow shells that eventually collapse. That's not business strategy, Mr. Sullivan. That's corporate parasitism." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of jet engines as the morning flights began their departures. Marcus closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara checked her watch. In 90 minutes, she would walk into a boardroom where Marcus Sullivan and his team would discover just how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. But first, she wanted him to understand the lesson being taught. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Mr. Sullivan. For the past 2 years, my family has been aware of your interest in acquiring Skyward Airlines. We've monitored your research, tracked your stock purchases, and observed your team's analysis of our company." She leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming almost professorial. "Everything you discovered during your due diligence process was information we wanted you to find. Every vulnerability you identified was deliberately presented. Every weakness you thought you could exploit was carefully constructed to lead you to exactly this moment." Marcus's face had gone completely white. "You're saying this was all a setup?" "I'm saying that sometimes the best way to deal with a persistent predator is to let it overextend itself," she replied, echoing her mother's words from the previous day. "You've spent nearly $2 billion acquiring a minority stake in a company you cannot control, using financing structures that leave you dangerously exposed to market fluctuations." She stood, smoothing her skirt as she prepared to deliver the final blow. "The board meeting in 90 minutes will formalize what was always true, that Skyward Airlines remains under Washington family control. But it will also announce some interesting developments that your presence has made possible." "What kind of developments?" Amara's smile was neither kind nor cruel, but rather the expression of someone who had just demonstrated a master class in strategic thinking. "You'll find out with everyone else, Mr. Sullivan. I suggest you prepare your remarks carefully. Today's board meeting will be recorded for regulatory compliance and shareholder transparency." As she reached the door, she paused for one final observation. "Oh, and Mr. Sullivan? Your reputation in the industry was built on being smarter and more ruthless than your targets. I hope you're prepared to explain to your investors how you managed to lose $2 billion to someone you considered academically qualified but practically naive." The door closed behind her, leaving Marcus Sullivan alone with the devastating realization that he had not just failed to acquire Skyward Airlines. He had walked directly into the most sophisticated corporate trap of his career, orchestrated by the woman he had dismissed as an unworthy opponent. The real board meeting was about to begin, and Dr. Amara Washington was ready to show the business world what true leadership looked like. The executive boardroom at Skyward Airlines had never felt more like a gladiatorial arena. At precisely 11:30 a.m., Marcus Sullivan entered to find the polished mahogany table already surrounded by faces he didn't recognize, and one he was beginning to fear. Dr. Amara Washington sat at the head of the table with the composed confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this meeting. To her right, Alexandria Carter reviewed documents with the measured attention of a chess master preparing her final moves. Around them, 12 board members represented a cross-section of business leadership that Marcus was only now beginning to understand he had completely misread. "Mr. Sullivan," Amara said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from her, "please join us. I believe you know my mother, Alexandria Carter, our board chair." As Marcus settled into his assigned seat, he noticed his own team members, scattered around the table like islands in hostile waters. Richard Pembroke fidgeted with his tie. Jonathan Blake stared at his legal pad as if it contained salvation, and David Chen appeared to be questioning every career decision that had led him to this moment. "Before we begin formal proceedings," Alexandria announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I'd like to introduce our board members to Mr. Sullivan and his associates, since they seem to have based their acquisition strategy on incomplete information about our governance structure." She gestured to a distinguished African-American woman in her 60s. Dr. Patricia Williams, former Secretary of Transportation under 2 administrations, currently chairs our Safety and Compliance Committee. Marcus felt his first flutter of genuine concern. A former cabinet-level official wasn't the kind of board member who appeared in standard corporate databases, especially if she preferred to maintain her privacy. "Judge Harold Morrison," Alexandria continued, indicating a stern-faced man whose judicial bearing was unmistakable, "retired from the Georgia Supreme Court, now chairs our Legal Affairs Committee." The introductions continued with increasing psychological impact. A former NASA administrator who oversaw their technology initiatives, the founding partner of one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms, the president emeritus of Morehouse College, a retired 4-star general who had revolutionized military logistics. Each introduction reinforced the same devastating truth. Skyward Airlines wasn't just a family business with hidden ownership structures. It was an institution protected by some of the most influential leaders in American aviation, business, and government, people whose support couldn't be bought through stock acquisitions or hostile takeovers. "Now then," Amara said, opening her leather portfolio with deliberate precision, "let's address the situation that brings us together today. Mr. Sullivan, would you care to explain your understanding of yesterday's stock acquisition?" Marcus cleared his throat, acutely aware that every word would be recorded and potentially used against him in future legal proceedings. Sullivan Strategic Holdings acquired what we believe to be a controlling interest in Skyward Airlines through legitimate market transactions with the intention of implementing operational improvements that would benefit all shareholders. "Operational improvements," repeated Dr. Williams, her tone suggesting she found the euphemism amusing. "Could you be more specific about these proposed improvements?" Jonathan Blake leaned forward, apparently deciding to salvage what he could from their strategic presentation. "We identified significant cost savings through the elimination of redundant employee programs, streamlined management structures, and optimized resource allocation." "You mean firing people and cutting benefits," stated Judge Morrison bluntly. "Let's use plain language, shall we?" The directness of the challenge caught Jonathan off guard. In previous hostile takeovers, board members had been polite adversaries who could be managed through careful presentation of financial projections and market analysis. These individuals seemed entirely unimpressed by corporate doublespeak. Amara pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal detailed financial projections. "Gentlemen, let me share some actual data about your proposed operational improvements. Based on your track record at previous acquisitions, we've modeled the likely outcomes of your leadership approach. She slid copies of the analysis to each board member, her movements deliberate and professional. Employee turnover would increase by an estimated 75% within the first year. Customer satisfaction ratings would decline by at least 20%. Operational efficiency would drop during the transition period and never recover to current levels. Marcus watched the board members review the projections, their expressions growing increasingly skeptical of Sullivan's strategic holdings value proposition. The analysis was thorough, professional, and devastating, showing exactly how his cost-cutting measures would destroy the foundation of Skyward's success. Furthermore, Amara continued, we've calculated the long-term financial impact of your proposed changes. While quarterly profits might spike initially, revenue would decline significantly within 18 months due to customer attrition and operational disruptions. She turned to a fresh page, her voice taking on the analytical tone of someone presenting a doctoral thesis. Your business model assumes that short-term profit maximization is the primary measure of corporate success. Our model prioritizes sustainable growth, employee retention, customer loyalty, and operational excellence. The data clearly demonstrates which approach creates more value over time. Richard Pembroke finally found his voice, though it lacked his earlier confidence. With respect, Dr. Washington, theoretical models don't always reflect real-world business conditions. Sullivan Strategic Holdings has a proven track record of turning around underperforming companies. Underperforming? Alexandria Carter's voice carried a sharp edge as she addressed Richard directly. Mr. Pembroke, Skyward Airlines has outperformed the industry average in every major metric for 7 consecutive years. Our market capitalization has increased by 240% under my daughter's leadership. What exactly do you consider underperforming? The silence that followed was broken only by the soft rustling of documents as board members continued reviewing the financial projections. Marcus realized with growing dread that this wasn't a negotiation or even a hostile confrontation. It was an education, and he was the unwilling student. "Let me address the elephant in the room," said General Patricia Stone, the retired 4-star general whose presence commanded immediate attention. Mr. Sullivan, your company has a disturbing pattern of targeting businesses led by women and minorities. Would you care to explain that coincidence? Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the room's comfortable temperature. Sullivan Strategic Holdings identifies undervalued companies regardless of their leadership demographics. Any patterns you might observe are purely coincidental. Coincidental, repeated Dr. Williams with obvious skepticism. 15 acquisitions. In 8 years, 14 of them companies led by women or people of color. That would be quite a coincidence indeed. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his judicial experience evident in his analytical approach to Marcus's claims. In my experience, patterns that appear statistically impossible usually aren't coincidental. They're systematic. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or disperse. Marcus had built his reputation on identifying what he called soft targets, companies whose leadership he could characterize as inexperienced or idealistic to justify his acquisition attempts. He had never acknowledged the demographic patterns in his targeting, even to himself. Perhaps we should move to the primary business at hand, Amara suggested, mercifully redirecting the conversation before Marcus could dig his hole any deeper. The question of corporate ownership and governance structure. She nodded to her mother, who withdrew a leather-bound document from her briefcase with ceremonial gravity. This is the complete ownership documentation for Skyward Airlines, compiled by 3 independent auditing firms and verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Alexandria opened the document to reveal a family tree that mapped 35 years of careful financial planning. Trusts established in the 1980s, holding companies registered across multiple jurisdictions, partnership agreements with pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, all designed to maintain family control while enabling public investment. The Washington family owns 51% of Skyward Airlines through a network of trusts and holding companies, she explained, her finger tracing the complex ownership structure. An additional 23% is held by our employee stock ownership program, which votes in alignment with family interests. The remaining 26% is publicly traded. Marcus stared at the documentation, finally understanding the scope of his miscalculation. Sullivan Strategic Holdings had acquired less than half of the publicly traded shares, giving them control of roughly 12% of the total company. They had spent $2 billion to become a powerless minority stakeholder in a company they could never control. However, Amara added, her tone suggesting more revelations were coming, recent events have prompted us to reconsider our ownership structure. She stood and walked to the presentation screen, clicking a remote to display a corporate organizational chart. The board has voted to implement several changes that will strengthen our position in the marketplace while addressing the threat posed by hostile acquisition attempts. The first slide showed a new subsidiary structure: Skyward International, Skyward Cargo, Skyward Maintenance Services, and Skyward Ground Operations. Each subsidiary was wholly owned by the parent company, but operationally independent, making hostile takeovers significantly more complex and expensive. Additionally, Amara continued, we're announcing a partnership with the African Union to establish Skyward Africa, providing air service to 23 countries currently underserved by major carriers. The African Development Bank is providing initial funding, with expansion supported by sovereign wealth funds from 6 nations. Marcus felt his remaining hopes for salvaging the situation evaporate. Not only had his acquisition attempt failed, but his actions had apparently catalyzed Skyward's expansion into markets that would make it one of the largest airlines in the world. Our employee stock ownership program will also be expanded, added Alexandria, increasing employee ownership to 30% of the company. This ensures that our workforce has a direct financial stake in our long-term success. The message was clear. Skyward Airlines was becoming more employee-owned, more internationally connected, and more resistant to hostile acquisition attempts. Sullivan Strategic Holdings hadn't just failed to acquire control, they had strengthened their target's defenses against future attacks. Finally, Amara said, clicking to her last slide, we're establishing the Washington Foundation for Corporate Ethics, dedicated to supporting businesses led by women and minorities who face hostile acquisition attempts. The foundation will provide legal support, financial resources, and strategic consulting to help these companies resist predatory corporate behavior. The room fell completely silent as the implications became clear. Not only had Marcus failed to acquire Skyward Airlines, but his attempt had inspired the creation of an organization specifically designed to prevent future attempts by companies like his. The Foundation's first case study, Alexandria added with a slight smile, will be documenting the Sullivan Strategic Holdings acquisition attempt as an example of how poor due diligence and demographic bias can lead to catastrophic business decisions. Marcus realized that his failure wouldn't just cost his company $2 billion. It would become a textbook example of corporate incompetence studied by business schools and used by potential targets to defend against similar attempts. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Morrison said, breaking the stunned silence, do you have any questions about the ownership structure or governance of Skyward Airlines? Marcus looked around the table at faces that ranged from professionally neutral to barely concealed satisfaction. His team members avoided eye contact, probably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from this debacle. No questions, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Then I believe our business is concluded, Amara announced, closing her portfolio with finality. Gentlemen, thank you for your interest in Skyward Airlines. I trust this experience has been educational. As the board members began filing out of the room, Marcus remained seated, staring at the polished table surface that reflected his stunned expression. The hostile takeover that was supposed to crown his career had instead revealed him to be exactly what Alexandria Carter had called him: a predator who had finally encountered prey that was actually a more skilled hunter. The game was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The elevator ride from the 24th floor felt like a descent into purgatory. Marcus Sullivan stood in the corner, watching the numbers decrease with each floor, each digit marking another step away from what he had thought was his greatest triumph, and toward what was shaping up to be his most spectacular failure. Richard Pembroke broke the suffocating silence first. "What the hell just happened up there?" His voice cracked with the strain of processing information that challenged everything he thought he understood about corporate power structures. "We got played," Jonathan Blake replied flatly, his financial mind already calculating the catastrophic implications for Sullivan's strategic holdings. Not just outmaneuvered, systematically manipulated for 2 years by people we assumed were amateurs. The elevator reached the parking garage, its doors opening, with a soft chime that seemed to mock their collective humiliation. As they walked toward their rental cars, Marcus felt the weight of his company's future pressing down on him like a physical force. "Sir?" David Chen ventured as they reached Marcus's black sedan. "What do we tell the investors?" Marcus paused, with his hand on the door handle, staring at his reflection in the tinted window. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the confident corporate raider who had flown to Atlanta just 2 days ago. That man had believed he was about to execute the acquisition of his career. This man was trying to figure out how to explain losing $2 billion to a woman he had dismissed as academically qualified but practically naive. "We tell them the truth," he said finally, though the words felt like ground glass in his throat. "We tell them that our due diligence was insufficient and our assumptions were incorrect." Richard scoffed, loosening his tie in a gesture that spoke to his complete loss of composure. "Marcus, you can't just tell Wellington Capital that we made a $2 billion mistake because we didn't bother to research the private ownership structure of our target company." "Then what do you suggest?" Marcus snapped, his carefully maintained executive demeanor finally cracking under the pressure. "That we pretend this didn't happen? That we somehow convince our investors that owning 12% of a company we can't control represents a strategic victory?" The parking garage seemed to amplify their voices, turning their conversation into an echo chamber of professional desperation. Around them, Skyward employees went about their daily routines, probably unaware that the men who had planned to destroy their workplace culture were falling apart just yards away. "There has to be something," Jonathan insisted, pulling out his phone to check the morning's stock prices. "Some legal challenge, some regulatory violation, some way to contest their ownership claims." Marcus watched his CFO's face pale as he reviewed the financial markets. Sullivan's Strategic Holdings stock price had dropped 8% since the market opened, driven by rumors of a failed acquisition attempt and questions about the company's due diligence processes. "The ownership documentation looked legitimate," David observed quietly. 3 independent auditing firms, SEC verification, board members with impeccable credentials. If there was fraud or misrepresentation, they've hidden it behind some very sophisticated legal work. "Legal work that we should have discovered," Marcus replied, finally opening his car door. "The truth is, gentlemen, that we were outclassed. From the beginning. The Washington family has been playing chess while we were playing checkers." As he settled into the driver's seat, Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Wellington Capital's managing partner. The investors who had backed Sullivan Strategic Holdings' acquisition strategy would want answers, and he didn't have any that would satisfy them. He declined the call, knowing it would only delay the inevitable conversation. Instead, he started the engine and pulled out of the parking garage, leaving his team to follow in their own vehicles for what would likely be a very uncomfortable flight back to New York. The 30-minute drive to the airport gave Marcus time to process the full scope of his miscalculation. Dr. Amara Washington hadn't just defended her company against a hostile takeover. She had transformed his attack into an opportunity for expansion and growth. The African Union partnership alone would add billions to Skyward's valuation, making his minority stake simultaneously more valuable and more meaningless. At Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, Marcus couldn't escape the irony of seeing Skyward Airlines aircraft everywhere he looked. Their silver and blue livery, which had seemed like a prize to be claimed just yesterday, now felt like a constant reminder of his failure. Passengers boarded flights operated by the company he had thought he could control, their journeys facilitated by employees whose jobs he had planned to eliminate. The corporate jet that had carried his team to Atlanta with such confidence now felt like a flying monument to hubris. As they taxied toward takeoff, Marcus stared out the window at the Skyward maintenance facilities where technicians worked on aircraft he would never own. "The media is already picking up the story," David reported, scrolling through his tablet, during the flight. Business Insider has a piece titled, "When Due Diligence Isn't Enough: The Sullivan Strategic Holdings Debacle." The Wall Street Journal is running an analysis of private ownership structures in publicly traded companies. Each headline felt like another nail in the coffin of Marcus's reputation. Worse, the articles weren't just reporting on a failed business deal. They were examining the patterns in his previous acquisitions, the demographic characteristics of his targets, and the long-term outcomes of his restructuring strategies. Fortune published something interesting, Richard said, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "They interviewed former employees from our previous acquisitions. The picture they're painting isn't very flattering." Marcus accepted the tablet and began reading testimonials from people whose careers had been disrupted by Sullivan Strategic Holdings' cost-cutting measures. Engineers who had been laid off from profitable companies, managers whose diversity initiatives had been eliminated, entire departments that had been outsourced to reduce costs. The human cost of his business model, which he had always viewed as necessary for efficiency, was being presented as systematic destruction of corporate cultures that had taken years to build. When viewed through this lens, his pattern of targeting companies led by women and minorities looked less like smart business strategy and more like predatory behavior. "Dr. Washington's foundation is already operational," Jonathan added, showing Marcus another article on his phone. "They've received inquiries from 12 companies that are facing hostile takeover attempts. The Washington Foundation for Corporate Ethics is offering legal support, financial analysis, and strategic consulting." The foundation that had been announced just hours earlier was already positioning itself as Sullivan's Strategic Holdings' nemesis, turning his failed acquisition attempt into the inspiration for a movement dedicated to preventing similar attacks. As the jet approached New York, Marcus found himself contemplating a future that looked radically different from the trajectory he had planned. His investors would demand explanations he couldn't provide. His reputation in the industry would be permanently tarnished by the most public failure of his career. His company's stock price would continue declining as the full scope of the Skyward debacle became clear. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that everything he had believed about his own competence had been systematically dismantled by people he had underestimated. Dr. Amara Washington and her mother had demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that made his previous successes look like accidental victories against unprepared opponents. The corporate jet touched down at Teterboro Airport just as the afternoon financial news was beginning its analysis of the day's major business stories. Marcus turned off his phone, unwilling to see how the Sullivan Strategic Holdings disaster was being discussed by industry analysts and financial commentators. In the limousine ride to his Manhattan office, he tried to prepare for conversations with investors, board members, and employees who would want to understand how their celebrated acquisition specialist had managed to lose $2 billion in a deal that had seemed like a guaranteed success. The Sullivan Strategic Holdings building on Park Avenue had always represented his achievements, its gleaming facade reflecting the success of a man who had built his fortune by identifying other people's weaknesses. Now it felt like a monument to overconfidence, its impressive appearance unable to disguise the fundamental failures in judgment that had led to the Skyward debacle. His assistant, Patricia Morrison, met him in the lobby with the kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested she had already heard about the Atlanta disaster. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "Wellington Capital has requested an immediate meeting. They're in conference room A." Marcus nodded, straightening his tie and attempting to summon whatever remained of his executive presence. The next few hours would determine whether Sullivan Strategic Holdings survived this catastrophe or joined the ranks of corporate casualties that served as cautionary tales in business schools. As the elevator rose toward his office, Marcus realized that his education in strategic thinking was just beginning. Dr. Amara Washington had taught him that success in business wasn't just about identifying weaknesses. It was about understanding strengths, respecting opponents, and recognizing that the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous. The lesson had cost him $2 billion and his reputation. But as the elevator doors opened to reveal a conference room full of concerned investors, Marcus began to understand that the true price of his arrogance was still being calculated. The reckoning had only just begun, and he was no longer the one controlling the terms of engagement. 6 months after the Skyward Airlines debacle, Marcus Sullivan stood in his empty corner office, packing the last of his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The Park Avenue views that had once represented his corporate dominance now served as a backdrop to his professional downfall. The Wellington Capital meeting that awaited him in Atlanta had been even more devastating than he had anticipated. The investors hadn't just demanded explanations for the $2 billion loss. They had commissioned an independent review of Sullivan Strategic Holdings' entire acquisition history. The results had been damning. "The forensic audit is complete," Patricia Morrison announced, entering his office with a thick folder that would seal his fate. As his longtime assistant, she had remained loyal through the company's collapse, but even her professionalism couldn't hide the disappointment in her voice. Marcus accepted the folder, though he already knew its contents would confirm his worst fears. The independent analysts had discovered what Dr. Amara Washington had tried to show him, that every acquisition Sullivan Strategic Holdings had completed had ultimately destroyed more value than it created. "The pattern is consistent across all 15 deals," Patricia continued, her voice carefully neutral. "Initial profit increases followed by long-term decline, employee exodus, customer attrition, and eventual bankruptcy or fire sale. The only beneficiaries were the senior executives who extracted value during the restructuring phases." The words hit him like physical blows because they were undeniably true. Marcus had built his reputation on being a turnaround specialist, but the forensic audit revealed him to be something far less honorable, a corporate vulture who had systematically destroyed healthy companies for short-term profit. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Settlement negotiations concluded. Personal assets protected, but company dissolution inevitable." The legal challenges had come from multiple directions simultaneously. Shareholders had filed class action lawsuits alleging mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Former employees from previous acquisitions had joined together to document systematic discrimination and harassment. The SEC had opened investigations into insider trading and market manipulation. But perhaps most devastating had been the reputational damage. The Washington Foundation for Corporate Ethics had turned his failed acquisition attempt into a case study that was now required reading in MBA programs across the country. Business schools used the Skyward Airlines incident to teach students about the importance of thorough due diligence, cultural sensitivity, and the dangers of unconscious bias in strategic decision-making. "There's something else," Patricia said, hesitating before handing him another document. "Dr. Washington sent this personally." Marcus opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter on Skyward Airlines letterhead. Her elegant script conveyed a message that was simultaneously gracious and devastating. "Mr. Sullivan, I wanted you to know that the Washington Foundation has successfully defended its first 12 client companies against hostile acquisition attempts. The legal strategies and financial structures we developed in response to your approach have proven remarkably effective in protecting businesses from predatory corporate behavior. More importantly, we've documented that companies led by diverse leadership teams consistently outperform their peers in long-term value creation when they're protected from short-term profit extraction schemes. Your failed acquisition attempt has inadvertently provided compelling evidence for the business case supporting diversity in corporate leadership. I hope this experience has been educational. The airline industry, like many sectors, is evolving to reward sustainable growth, employee engagement, and customer loyalty over the quarterly profit maximization strategies that defined previous generations of business leaders. Skyward Airlines continues to prosper. Our African expansion has exceeded all projections. Our employee satisfaction remains at industry-leading levels, and our customer loyalty ratings have reached record highs. We recently announced a partnership with the European Union to establish carbon-neutral transatlantic service, further solidifying our position as an industry leader in sustainable aviation. I wish you well in your future endeavors. Perhaps this setback will provide an opportunity for reflection on more constructive approaches to business leadership. Sincerely, Dr. Amara Washington, CEO, Skyward Airlines. Marcus set the letter aside, feeling the full weight of how completely he had misunderstood both the woman and the situation. Dr. Washington wasn't gloating over his downfall. She was documenting it as a learning experience that would benefit others. The final board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, Patricia reminded him. Wellington Capital will formally dissolve Sullivan Strategic Holdings and distribute the remaining assets to creditors and shareholders. The company Marcus had built over 15 years would cease to exist within 24 hours. His personal fortune, while protected by legal structures, had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. More significantly, his reputation in the corporate world was permanently destroyed. But as he packed his awards and photographs into boxes, Marcus found himself thinking not about what he had lost, but about what he had never understood. The businesses he had acquired hadn't been failing. Companies saved by his intervention. They had been successful enterprises destroyed by his arrogance. The employees he had laid off hadn't been inefficiencies to be eliminated. They had been human beings whose careers and livelihoods he had disrupted for financial gain. The diversity programs he had cut hadn't been wasteful spending. They had been investments in innovation and talent retention that created competitive advantages. His phone rang with a call from Richard Pembroke, who had managed to find employment as a mid-level manager at a regional consulting firm. The men who had once celebrated their corporate conquests now worked in positions that paid less in a year than they had once earned in bonuses. Marcus, Richard's voice carried the defeated tone of someone still processing his professional downfall. I saw the article in Harvard Business Review. They're calling the Skyward case the Sullivan syndrome, when unconscious bias leads to catastrophic strategic miscalculations. The academic analysis of his failure had been thorough and damning. Business researchers had identified systematic patterns in his target selection, documented the demographic characteristics of his victims, and quantified the long-term economic damage caused by his acquisition strategies. There's something I need to tell you, Richard continued. Something I should have said months ago. Dr. Washington was right about everything. The employee programs we wanted to cut, the diversity initiatives we mocked, the profit-sharing arrangements we considered wasteful, they were actually the foundation of Skyward's competitive advantage. Marcus closed his eyes, finally ready to acknowledge what he had been avoiding for 6 months. I know, Richard. We were wrong about everything. Not just wrong, Richard corrected. Systematically, deliberately wrong. We targeted successful companies led by people we thought we could dismiss, and we convinced ourselves that our prejudices were business insights. The confession hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the systematic discrimination that had driven their strategy. They had never explicitly discussed targeting companies led by women and minorities, but the pattern had been unmistakable to everyone except themselves. After ending the call, Marcus walked to his office window. One last time. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him, representing opportunities and achievements that would no longer be available to someone with his reputation. But as he contemplated his future, Marcus realized that Dr. Washington had given him something more valuable than corporate success. She had forced him to confront the consequences of his actions and the prejudices that had driven his decisions. The Washington Foundation's work was expanding rapidly. Companies across the country were adopting the defensive strategies developed in response to his attack. Business schools were teaching courses on ethical leadership using his failures as cautionary examples. A new generation of corporate leaders was learning to recognize and resist the predatory tactics he had perfected. His phone buzzed with one final message, this time from Dr. Washington's assistant. Dr. Washington will be speaking at the Harvard Business School Leadership Conference next month. Her presentation is titled, From Defense to Offense: How Targeted Companies Can Turn Hostile Attacks into Growth Opportunities. Thought you might be interested. Marcus smiled despite himself. Even in victory, Dr. Washington was focused on helping others rather than celebrating his defeat. Her approach to business leadership, collaborative, sustainable, focused on long-term value creation, had not only protected her company, but had inspired a movement that would protect countless others. As he carried his boxes toward the elevator for the last time, Marcus encountered Patricia, who was also preparing to leave for a new position. Her loyalty had been one of the few bright spots during the company's collapse. "What will you do now?" she asked, her professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. Marcus paused, considering a question he had been avoiding for months. The corporate world that had once celebrated his aggressive acquisition tactics now viewed him as a cautionary tale. Traditional executive positions were closed to him, and his reputation made him unemployable in the industry he had once dominated. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm going to learn something new. Maybe teach, maybe consult. But on the other side of these transactions, help companies defend themselves against the kind of attacks I used to launch." Patricia nodded approvingly. "That sounds like it could be meaningful work." As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Marcus reflected on the irony of his situation. Dr. Amara Washington had destroyed his company not through aggression or revenge, but by demonstrating a superior approach to business leadership. She had turned his attack into an opportunity for growth, his prejudices into teachable moments, and his failure into inspiration for others. The hostile takeover that was supposed to crown his career had instead revealed the fundamental flaws in his understanding of what made businesses successful. Companies thrived not because they eliminated inefficiencies like employee welfare programs, but because they invested in the human capital that drove innovation and customer loyalty. 6 months after walking into Skyward Airlines boardroom, as a conquering corporate raider, Marcus Sullivan emerged onto Park Avenue as something he had never been before. A man who understood the difference between extracting value and creating it. The education had cost him everything he thought he valued, but as he walked away from his former empire, Marcus realized that Dr. Washington had given him something more valuable than corporate success, the opportunity to build something better from the foundation of his failure. Behind him, the Sullivan Strategic Holdings building would soon house new tenants who might approach business with the wisdom he had learned too late. Ahead of him lay the possibility of redemption through helping others avoid the mistakes that had defined his career. The hostile takeover was over, but the real work of transformation was just beginning, not for Skyward Airlines, which continued to soar, but for the man who had finally learned to see beyond his own limitations. In the end, Dr. Amara Washington had achieved something far more significant than defending her company. She had turned a predator into a protector, a destroyer into a defender, and a cautionary tale into a story of genuine transformation. The revolution in corporate leadership that began with one failed acquisition would continue long after Marcus Sullivan had been forgotten. But the lessons learned from his failure would protect countless companies and employees from similar attacks. Sometimes the most powerful victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's teaching them to become better than they were. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe.